about the crisis inside Venezuela. What do you make of the nature of it? Is really, quote unquote, a terminology like a socialism to blame?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your program. I don't think the nature of the crisis responds necessarily to the ideological aspect of the government. But, however, the government is to blame for the crisis. In the last 3 years, we have seen a sharp decrease of the quality of life of Venezuelans. Here in Caracas and all over our country, we have to do these massive queues and lines in order to get food, to get medicine, to get the most basic needs. And the people are not content with the situation. Our studies show that over 86% of all Venezuelans show strong dissatisfaction with the government and with the situation. Over 60% of Venezuelans think the situation will get worse in the next 12 months. And who do Venezuelans blame for this? They blame the government directly. So it's not an issue of ideology, if it's capitalism or it's socialism. It's an issue of a government that is perceived by Venezuelans as being very inefficient in being able to provide. And that, of course, has to do with the economic aspect of the government. The model which Chavismo has placed upon the Venezuelan people heavily relied on oil prices.
Right.
Venezuela is a country that only produces and exports oil. We have no other means of production, and everything we consume, be it medicine, food, supplies, is all imports.
Right, and this is exactly what I want to ask you. This is exactly what I want to ask you, Mr. Fermin, that the oil inside your country, let's take a look at some of the numbers. Many of the Venezuela's problems come down to oil, as they say. A quicker look and a closer look. It has the largest oil reserves in the world at more than 299 billion barrels. Oil reserves and revenue account for about 95% of the export earnings, and the oil and the gas sector covers around a quarter of the GDP. But to save oil for export, more than 60% of Venezuela's power comes from hydropower, now in trouble also due to drought caused by El Nino. So the question really is, you also got a number there in terms of the money being earned. The country requires oil prices about $120 per barrel to balance its budget. But right now, as we all know, the price for each barrel is only $50. Huge gap over there. This is what I really want to ask you, Mr. Fermin, if you can briefly. Is oil a blessing or a curse, in fact, for your country?
Well, it has been a blessing, and it was a blessing for most of the 20th century. Oil provided us with the means for development, for economic development, for social development. But now, in the last 20 years, what we have to ask ourselves is, where did the oil money go? Other oil-producing countries are not going through this crisis because they saved up for rainy days. They had the provision to save and invest their oil revenue into sustainable activities. Venezuela has not diversified their economy. The government spent all of the money, and corruption ran rampant. And that is the consequence that we're seeing right now. We ran out of money, we spent the money, there was huge corruption, and now, since we only depend on oil prices and oil prices are down, we're really having a rough time. And I also want to make something very clear. El Nino is obviously a natural phenomenon, but it is not to blame for our energy crisis. Venezuela has not built any dams. Venezuela has not built any hydroelectric plants since 1997. So what we see is its lack of investment in the energy sector, which is controlled by the government, that has us Venezuelans going through power shortages and blackouts all over the country.
I see. Mr. Yang here in Beijing, whether you agree with an ideology is something to blame or not, we'll leave it to you to explain. But on the other hand, where did it begin in terms of the failed policies when it comes to economic development in Venezuela? And can the current administration, Mr. Maduro, by claiming emergency of the state be able to buy time and try to solicit all the possible strengths in order to change the policy for the right direction?
I think it's very difficult. I think now, judging from the situation happening in Venezuela, it's more than the political crisis or economic crisis. I think more than that, maybe we should add the energy crisis and the social crisis. So I think even Maduro announced the emergency, the state of emergency. It's not enough to change the performance of the economy and the political situation, because Venezuelan the crisis, I think for one hand, it's come from the external environment, and most important in the domestic affairs. So how to, in a difficult time, find solutions is very important. But
right.
It's a little bit late for him.
A little bit late for him, for President Maduro. That's, of course, your personal opinion. Let me come back to you, Mr. Fermin. In the end of last year, you've already seen the opposition party of your country being the majority of the Congress, the parliament. That seemed to already a very clear message the public sent to the current administration. And now you've got two parties at different offices. Can they be able to come up with certain kinds of consensus? Whether it's late or not is one question, but whether even when it's late, no action, that will be even more severe, the problem.
Well, President Maduro is not acknowledging how legitimate the National Assembly is right now. As you know, in Venezuela in December, we had elections and the opposition won a landslide, winning the supermajority in the Congress. So what we're seeing now is a conflict between branches of power that is really not doing much to resolve the situation. I do see the necessity of dialogue between the parts, but I don't see it happening in the near future, because what I see is President Maduro going very strongly against the National Assembly, which is controlled by the opposition, and the opposition's agenda is for political change. They want to recall Mr. Maduro, which is an instrument that is in our constitution, the ability to call for a recall referendum on Mr. Maduro's term. And the whole government and the state itself is very strongly placing obstacles upon this referendum or this possibility of holding a referendum, because they see it as an election that they cannot win. So I do see that both parties, or both parties should sit down and try to resolve the crisis. That is what logic and common sense dictates, and what the crisis dictates. But I don't see it happening. I see two parties that are very entrenched in their positions and not talking to one another. And that is, in most part, the responsibility of Mr. Maduro, because he refuses to acknowledge the opposition as legitimate actors.
All right. Ms. MaGowan, of course you're in Washington, D.C. You're not originally from Venezuela, but certainly from also an important country, Bolivia, inside Latin America. Let me ask you about your personal judgment as to how things likely to evolve. Now we see protesters on the streets of Venezuela. We see political crisis, economic crisis, all happen at the same time and also intertwined. We see the governing party inside the administration not working necessarily with the assembly. So what can we next predict likely to happen in the country? Can regional players in Latin America be able to help the country a bit out of the crisis moment, at least for now?
Well, at the moment, the country is already suffering from violence, tremendous violence. Just this morning, a man was burned alive by the mob because he was accused of stealing a comparable amount of money, comparable to $5, and people were cheering while he was being burned alive on the streets. But what it needs to be done immediately is for President Maduro to leave. I don't see any other solution. It is, I maintain that it's socialism. There are no excuses here. They stopped building dams in 1997. Chavez started in 1998. Other oil-producing countries, as my colleague said, they don't have this kind of problems because they diversified, they allowed foreign investment, which Maduro did not or Chavez did not. However, there's one small hope that I see here. They allow China to get loans from China and investments from China. I think China is their hope right now, and they could probably bail them out one more time, but with conditions. They cannot just continue giving money. They have to put the condition first Maduro leaves. And China will have to apply the models that they have, especially in foreign trade. China has been very successful in that area. That's what needs to be done in Venezuela immediately. I fear the violence that we are already seeing.
Right. We all fear around the world about violence inside any country, in Venezuela as well. Mr. Yang, since Ms. MaGowan talked about China, even though China is such a far away partner, I mean, United States, Brazil, Argentina, these are countries much nearby. But what do you make of the loans that China lent to Venezuela in order to quote unquote bail the country out, at least temporarily? But of course, those loans have not yet been returned to China. What does China make of this kinds of relationship with Venezuela, and particularly at the crisis moment?
I think your question makes me think of a saying, a friend in need is friend indeed. So I think for one hand, China and Venezuela are good friends, have the traditional good relationship. On the other hand, the two countries have very good commercial relations. You mentioned that the Chinese banks or financial institutions gave the loans to Venezuela, and also we found the very creative model. We call it the loan for oil. I think it's a win-win solution. So,
but what about at this moment?
At this moment, I think.
I mean, every country has its own economy to worry about and also to care about, and of course, a certain kinds of a stable and win-win situation has to be the solution. So, very briefly from you, and then I'll go to our Venezuela colleague.
So, I think in a difficult time, we should not forget the good time we have spent together with Venezuela. So in difficult time, I think, for one hand, we can do our best to help the country. I think we have our own conditions. That means the loan have conditions. It's not freely to give the country, but within the financial institutions, like the contract. So the hope is not in China of the country, but in itself. But China can do its best to help.
Yes, indeed. But on the other hand, Mr. Fermin, what do you make of all the neighboring countries, Brazil now also in its own political crisis, Argentina right after election? Of course, the new president has a different way of doing things. Whether to have a new relationship with Venezuela is another thing. And the United States, quote unquote, namely relying on the regional powers, namely meaning doing nothing about what's going on inside Venezuela. What do you make of the latest situation? And can Venezuela itself be able to dig itself out of this crisis?
I do think that our problems, Venezuela's problems, have to be resolved by Venezuelans. The international community support is vital, however, in drawing attention to the problems that we are facing. For way too much time, the international community was not focused on Venezuela. What we're seeing now is a concern of our neighbors and concerns of our economic partners as to the well-being of Venezuelan and the well-being of their investments in Venezuela. So I do see that international actors, but especially the regional actors, I'm talking about Brazil, I'm talking about Colombia, I'm talking about Argentina, those are the countries that have to step up, and the regional organizations as well, the OAS, Mercosur, UNASUR, and even the United Nations. Those are the places where the Venezuelan discussion has to be taking place right now. And I think their support is very, very important, as I just mentioned. But our problems ultimately have to be resolved domestically by Venezuelans.